Monolith Soft has been doing an amazing job with the Xenoblade Chronicles. Both Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and 3 on the Nintendo Switch were standout RPGs on this already lauded console, and it seems like whatever we end up getting as part of Xenoblade 4 is gonna turn a lot of heads, since the director Tetsuya Takahashi has been putting out some relatively interesting quotes regarding on what they're planning to do with the franchise going forward, and admittedly is something that is probably not going to be to the liking to everyone, even though certainly he wishes it be. So originally, as part of the Xenoblade Chronicles 3 original soundtrack version being officially showcased, as the limited edition is already up for pre-order, a couple of developer quotes specifically from the Monolith Soft director Tetsuya Takahashi kind of made their way into social media. Originally they were posted in Japanese, of course, but since then they have been translated by different outlets. I'm going to be providing a couple of links in the video description below to kind of course, source the proper places. But what we're looking at here is that Mr. Takahashi basically states that the next game is going to be a whole heck of a lot more different and something that players essentially will not recognize. While we can circle back to the OST and some of the discussion regarding Ouroboros in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and plenty of things to talk about there, I think the juicy and more interesting part, and most likely the reason why you clicked on this video, is for what he spoke about what the next game could potentially look like. In many quotes that they provided, again, link in all the description below, one of the interesting quotes that's been translated states the following. When talking about his stance on developing video games, he says, rather than playing defense, going on the offense rather than to maintain. This is a stance that I have continued to hold for 30 years as a developer. If there is another Xenoblade, it will most likely be vastly different from what came before it. In styles and music, I would like to make a new next goal, something that will betray everyone's expectations in a good way. So not only does he expect, of course, the music to be different, but visually, aesthetically, and maybe even gameplay wise, and of course even combat wise, for the game to be vastly different. And this is one of those criticisms that has been levied to the franchise probably since Xenoblade Chronicles 2, where the combat encounters and the way the UI and the HUD have just so many layered options, one on top of another. I think it became something of a meme in Xenoblade Chronicles 2, where it was just too many things happening at the same time. With Xenoblade Chronicles 3, not much of that actually changed, although the developers did try to clarify that the combat system was a little bit more simplified, but in reality, as someone who's played all of the Xenoblade games, I can honestly tell you the first one was probably the most simplest one. Yes, they have become more intuitive and they're easy to see. Things on the screen are clearly labeled, but for a lot of first-time players, there's just too many things going on the screen, and honestly, it probably needs a reinvention, an uphold from the ground up. A complete reinvention from the ground up is probably the way to go. Now, some of the other quotes that they talk about here is regarding the Ouroboros and many other things. When the term was decided upon, they mentioned the music director for this title fell into more of a smooth type of sequence. This was clear concept and strong foundations. Again, this is all originally in Japanese. Uniformly, though, across all the tracks, this is something that they feel that they ended up getting right all along. It is an incredible way for each one of the songs to complement one another and continue from then on. He specifically talks about the song called Carrying the Weight of Life, a track that takes the cues from Engage the Enemy in the Xenoblade franchise. There was something about it that didn't sit right with him, and he should say beforehand, the quality of the music itself is very high. He's always impressed by Hamaru's passion for writing music, and it's undoubtedly one of the best songs in the editions, that there is no doubt that is one of the best songs in the entire soundtrack. but also talking about how to like care and how to provide things for users or essentially players. They talk about balancing a way to revere your work as a developer and also a way to service players at the same time. He mentions that is somewhat of a challenging event, trying to develop a game and also hit on marks that they tried to improve upon from a previous title and get players interested in what might come next while also meeting their expectations. And this shouldn't come to too much of a surprise. We've heard plenty of developers throughout the years talk about that maybe their own success could lead to their very own failure. They cannot necessarily live up to some of the things that they've tried to do in the past. And that is one of those things that a lot of developers just try to always surpass their previous work, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily always happen. What we can certainly expect here is that Xenoblade Chronicles 4, which they did not necessarily confirm is actually going to be happening, but it's something that they have talked about before. I want to say maybe about 4 months ago or so, I made a previous video from a previous article where they were talking about just kind of brainstorming ideas on what the next thing for Xenoblade could potentially be, and alongside that was the suggestion of like maybe more entries near the future. They didn't even actually say something that would be a next gen game or whatever, like Switch 2 or whatever. It was just something that they're already brainstorming. So of course, keeping with the release date schedule that they have had within 3 to 4 years, now we should be able to expect something happening sooner rather than later. And if they're going to be trying to reinvent the wheel, you can imagine that they're going to try to do something extremely different while still catering to that audience. The real question would be though, if Xenoblade fans, which admittedly have had a lot of games that are relatively similar to each other, even X to that degree still follows that same formula, would be willing to embrace something that is much more different and maybe even more traditional RPG fashion. Do they stick to tailoring the MMO-like RPG experience that you still get with Xenoblade, with many characters on the screen all fighting at once with pseudo control over each one of them, or you control a main one? Would they be willing to kind of do something more smaller team, smaller party, focus on more on a one-on-one, 2-to-1, 3-to-1 type of scenario, encounters with enemies? Would they be willing to get rid of the notion of just big worlds that are essentially living creatures and you're traversing an entire, essentially, let's call it an animal or a monster or something, a being, while you're exploring the world? Would they be willing to do something different in that regard and scale it down a little bit? One of my biggest criticisms that I had for Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which again I was very favorable to towards the end of the game, but while I was actually playing it, one of my criticisms was the same one that I had for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, but maybe to another degree. And that was the fact that it just felt relatively big, repetitive, and empty to some degree. There were a lot of explorable areas, sure, plenty of enemies everywhere for you to fight, absolutely, but just a lot of just trekking from one place to another with not really anything there to do. Sure, plenty of side quests, I should say, take you to certain areas around the map, in whichever map you happen to be exploring, or a side quest or side content or whatever to gather some materials to fight a notorious monster here or there. But it just kind of felt maybe too parsed out. Your character always felt relatively small in the massive grand scheme of the world itself, literally, not just figuratively, based off of the story, of course. And it just kind of just didn't land with me the third time that I played it like that. Obviously, the original Xenoblade did that, and to high praise, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 did that for me personally a little bit better. But then the third time around with Xenoblade Chronicles 3, I've seen it, I've been there, I've explored it. Maybe let's do something different. I didn't play X, so that is definitely something that I missed out on. I always hoped that they would re-release it on the Nintendo Switch, but it seems like that's not going to be a feasible thing. You would imagine that the funds that they got from 3 record-breaking sales for the franchise would fund the remaster for Xenoblade Chronicles X onto the Nintendo Switch, but they never really decided to do that. Maybe it would be a happy surprise before the Switch 2. But at the end of the day, whatever they decide to do for the next franchise introduction or reintroduction, hopefully is something interesting that we haven't seen before. But that's about all the information that I have for you guys today. Link in the description below for all of the developer quotes. If you're brand new to my channel, though, be sure to leave a like or subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up, and as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.